Hello. I'd like to take a look at a topic that I'm going to call what makes for a highly respectful person and why do we love being respected? Well, I would say first of all that I see a big tie-in between the idea of being respected and being well loved. And while there may be a lot of talk of love being shown by actions, I think personally, from my experience now in life at age 60, I think the lion's share of love has to do with an attitude, not simply what someone's doing for us. And by attitude, I think a large part of that can amount to how well someone is respecting us or we're respecting others. And again, that is sort of an attitude that gets conveyed to others. So what do I mean? What am I thinking about? What are my thoughts on respect? And why do we even like being respected and hate being disrespected? In fact, in days, let's say 100 years ago, 200 years ago, if you were to, quote, disrespect another man, they would tend to say it was a slight to their honor and that this might be followed by a duel with pistols, possibly to the death. That one's honor, or in other words, being respected or disrespected, was one of the most important things to a person in life. So, again, I bring up the question, what do we mean by respect? Well, first of all, I think and foremost, I would have to say that it's pretty obvious on the surface that we all humans have limitations or flaws. We all have fears, we all have ways of going about life that aren't so effective sometimes. We all have certain misconceptions, limiting beliefs. Some might have called them delusions, especially in the past. Illusions. We all have our own addictions, our own drugs of choice. But I think where things get sticky in life is if we tend to forget that there's quite a bit of variety amongst all of us, and we're not all the same. We don't all come out of the same mold, the same set of experiences, by far. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes it's so hard to wrap our heads around this, especially if we're kind of segregated in a community or even a country or region of the country where we may have a lot of similarities. So we can sometimes forget just how differently we may have grown up from each other. Or maybe even that we can forget that having a different body type than someone else. Say we're of average height and average build versus someone either short or tall and skinny, maybe thin. So we can all have a lot of different types of limitations that make us quite different than each other. But then what kind of consequence is this to us all? If we don't have the same limitations, the same flaws, the same constraints, why would this be a problem? Well, I suppose at the present time I see the problem as this, in a nutshell. That if someone is quite different than us, let's say with respect to a certain belief or belief system or some way of coping with life that we don't find comfortable to be around, and maybe we term it toxic even, well, then I suppose it's so easy for us all, especially if we lack a lot of key pieces of information, to think along these lines, and that is, why don't you just change? We might say, I can see where you're going wrong so easily. Why can't you get it? Why can't you Why can't you get your act together? Why can't you pull yourself up by your bootstraps? We might say, it's so obvious to me where you're going wrong. Why can't you see it like I do? Or we might say, gee whiz, this is such a no-brainer. Why can't you see this? It's obvious. But there's the whole rub then, isn't it? That depending on how we're raised, what assets we're given, and what we might have been even forced to believe that isn't true about ourselves and the world, misconceptions and all, what is obvious to us might be rocket science to someone else to try and solve, on their own especially. Yes, rocket science. Or to put it another way, what's child's play to us, like ABC or 1, 2, 3, or just putting your pants on, so to speak, might be extremely arduous. Might be like climbing Mount Kilimanjaro to somebody else. And if we don't understand this and why this could even be, this huge gap, then I think we're going to be in real trouble relationship-wise. And living in this world in general, especially when we're encountering more and more types of people than let's say a couple hundred years ago, due to the greater ease of travel, say. So if we think it's very easy for someone else to, let's say, shift gears and get on board, so to speak, change, see things the way we do, that we think is better and more effective, then I kind of see the following that could play out very easily, probably does play out. We might say things like, why don't you try harder? Or, why don't you stop being so lazy? Or, why don't you get your act together? Or we might say, if only they wanted to, they could change. We might even say, where there's a will, there's a way, right? So you must have a low willpower. And, well, someone might be able to tolerate hearing any of these phrases or this general attitude once or twice. I suppose that especially in a relationship or work situation, any place where we rub shoulders with someone repeatedly for a long period of time, it's going to be problematic to hear someone say things like this that I think can be encapsulated by the word nagging. That nobody wants to be nagged in the sense of being told something over and over again as to how we should change or see things differently when what they think is so easy to do could be extremely hard for us. And then that's a problem that the other person has, isn't it? To think that change can happen instantaneously and very easily, and by this notion of just willpower or picking yourself up by your bootstraps or, quote, stopping being lazy. Say, for instance, if we're married to someone and maybe the other person has a drug of choice that we don't like overeating or imbibing with alcohol or something else too much, or gambling, or leaving things lying around the house to excess, and maybe we're not the same way. I think of The Odd Couple, for instance, from TV. Well, I suppose if we think that someone else can change their habits that may be noxious to us, toxic, overnight or easily, especially if good help isn't available or is very unaffordable or whatever else, well, I think this can really shift into nagging very quickly, and in the sense of repeatedly bringing up a person's flaws or misconceptions in general, over and over again when that person can't change very easily. Well, I suppose then that can really toxify a relationship, driving it into non-communication or a breakup of some sort. So then maybe that's where the words like getting along with other people or making compromises or understanding others comes into play, as opposed to having little understanding followed by a lot of nagging, in the sense of wanting to force others to change by bringing up their flaws over and over and over again, that maybe we find discomforting, but it being very problematic then to long-term relationships. So I think then at this point I would kind of throw out a few words I see talked of sometimes, like don't be judgmental or don't blame others so much. Well, I suppose those words in my mind come back to talking of this non-understanding or poor understanding of others, followed by excessive desire to change them, when that kind of change might not be very easy at all, especially if we're talking some addiction process going on. So I think that the term respect then simply is alluding to talking about someone else having a general understanding that our flaws, which are different than theirs, perhaps considerably, first of all, aren't easily changeable, and second of all, really didn't originate by our desire to have those flaws in the first place. They weren't chosen, in other words, these flaws. You might say they were put upon us, inflicted even on us. And how so? Well, first by our biology, I think. Our brains have certain limitations and give us certain predispositions, like to having a lot of fear when we're under stress for survival or our self-esteem. And secondly, our brains are designed to forget quite a bit. So we're limited simply on these factors. And third, by the desire to procreate, so to speak, in order to survive as a species. So these are all limitations we all have to an extent. But secondly, limitations as to what experiences we are then brought up with in childhood and in our society, and also what kind of body type we inherit. So each of us are similar in some respects, but quite different in others. But then here's where I think it gets quite problematic or sticky, if you will. It's if we may understand certain biological limitations we all have in common, but don't understand the extent, the tremendous extent of difference in ways we may be raised. Whether some received a lot of trauma and some didn't, or let's say whether some received a lot of misconceptions as to life, the world and ourselves, and others maybe didn't, or some received certain kinds of misconceptions in certain ways and others in certain other ways that were quite different. So if we don't understand how this can be, and that there's concrete examples of it, well, I suppose it's very easy for us to want to force others to change as if it's very easy. And then I would say that this is kind of part and parcel of showing disrespect, of saying, why don't you get your act together? It seems so easy to me, just do it, so to speak. So I can see this playing out big time very easily in the following manner, say. Some big ideas here being politics, religion, or approaches to sexuality and marriage. All of these we can be brought up to live in and see in very different ways. if we don't understand as human beings why someone might have a different view than ours, a different way of being brought up, or maybe even a different body type predisposing us to certain ways in these topic matters, well, I suppose we would want others to change to our views or our ways, and do so very easily too, when that's not so easy. I'm reminded humorously, I would say, almost in closing now, of the movie Twins with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito. For those who have seen this movie, it comes as no surprise that early on, Arnold Schwarzenegger is pictured being brought up on an island by scientists, and he was genetically designed and supposed to be both genetically perfect and perfectly trained. And that at the same time he discovers he has a brother who was not of this sort, perhaps genetically not so well inclined, and received no training in any respect in life. So, interestingly, in the movie, Arnold Schwarzenegger realizes this about his brother and has compassion and recognizes that his brother never had opportunities he did. Or you might say even in life outside of the movies, that he had received misconceptions as to life in certain areas, or certain misconceptions we didn't have, and maybe we're seeing in different areas. At any rate, this movie, I think, being a good exemplar of how Arnold Schwarzenegger had respect for his brother who was quite different. I'd also say one more example I've seen of high degree of respect accorded, and that was by Johnny Cash toward prisoners at Folsom Prison. Oh, I think in the 1960s, where Johnny Cash did a concert once at Folsom Prison, and some of the people there were there for having ended the life of others. You call it murder, and well, Johnny Cash exemplified himself by somehow being able to understand where they had come from. Now, Johnny Cash himself had been arrested 6 or 7 times, so I suppose right there he understood how criminality could come about. If you want to call it even criminality, gone amok, let's say, in the form of murder. But at any rate, it became apparent probably in 2 to 5 seconds, I'd say, when Johnny Cash was singing to the prisoners that he was quite different. He understood where they were coming from. He understood what it was like to walk in their shoes. He kind of had an intuitive sense that they had suffered some horrendous things in life that maybe drove them to what they did, or they had been brought up to think in certain ways that were quite toxic and misconceptions of life in general. And Johnny Cash had a good grip on this, at least on that aspect of their lives. And that's what I mean then when I think of the word respect, that he understood quite well where they were coming from and why it was so hard to change, and also that it, quote, wasn't their fault. So then the upshot being that Johnny Cash was not there nagging them and telling them what awful people they were, and furthermore how it should be so easy to change and reform, when life is really very rarely that easy, I think, in terms of changing. So maybe as I'm talking right now, I would clarify this to the best I can and say that I think maybe the upshot of respect and showing respect is not only being able to walk in others' shoes as per understanding who they are and how they think and why and what they do, but furthermore in understanding that they got that way not of their own choice, and that everybody does the best they can in terms of what they were given and what their genetics constrain them to be. And the upshot, most of all, being that it's not easy to change. And if you doubt that, just talk with someone close to you, maybe, who's had a problem with some kind of addiction. For instance, an aunt of mine once telling me how difficult it was to stop smoking. And that they had tried over and over before finally succeeding, and how this was a crowning achievement in their life once they finally broke free of that. Or if someone has struggled with too much imbibing of alcohol, or many other, quote, drugs of choice, or maybe we're talking again something like from The Odd Couple, where someone is highly perfectionistic or obsessive, if you will. These things, of course, are not easy to change, and why that is, of course, is a totally different venue and question, but to understand this simple fact, I think, that change isn't easy, and thus we should all try and cut others slack, is probably in my mind, the crux of what respect is all about. That we're all different, and that changing is very hard. And thus nobody appreciates being nagged, so to speak, told repeatedly that change is easy, and that we know how they could change if only they wanted to, and that line of thinking being quite toxic to anyone hearing it. That's almost like saying to someone coming from the battlefield who lost their legs something like, why don't you just grow some new legs? It seems so easy to me how you could do so. Just get online and order a new pair of legs, you fool. I say that humorously, but I think many of us kind of live life that way, as though growing a new pair of legs when we lost a pair or never got a pair were as simple as 1, 2, 3, when it's not. I hope this is somewhat useful to people, and it helps clarify my own thoughts too. I'm no Oregon of perfection myself, and simply doing this piece here helps me develop my own thoughts too, and grow. So I wish you well.